My son stepped out onto his front porch, pulled the door mostly closed behind him, and said, "Dad, I need you to go. Melissa's on her way home." It was a Thursday evening in November, cold enough to see your breath but not cold enough to matter. I had a steel toolbox in my right hand, the old-style kind with the cantilever tray that flips up when you crack the lid, and I'd driven 2.5 hours from Bledsoe Creek to stand on his porch and tell him something he'd needed to hear for about 3 years. I never got the first sentence out. My name is Warren Holt. I'm 67 years old and I restore cars, not as a hobby, as a living. I've got a two-bay shop on 6 acres outside of Bledsoe Creek, Tennessee, and I've been working in it one way or another since I was 19. Classic cars, muscle cars from the 60s and 70s, the kind other people gave up on. I want to tell you what I look like, so you can see it the way my son saw me that night. I'm not tall. My hands are permanently stained. 40 years of grease works itself into the lines of your palms and doesn't come out, not fully no matter what you use. I drive a 1984 F-250 that's got more primer showing than paint. I wear the same 3 flannels in rotation, and I know I do because my daughter Vera has mentioned it. Once, in a Cracker Barrel parking lot, she said, "Dad, is that the blue one or the gray one?" I said yes, and that was the entire conversation. My wife Ruth ran the business side for 31 years. She kept the books, handled the clients, answered the phone, with a voice that made people feel better before she'd said anything of substance. She died 26 months ago from complications after a surgery that was supposed to be routine. She was 63. We were in the middle of a restoration, a 67 Mustang Fastback that had been sitting in a barn in Cookeville for 11 years. And when I got home from the hospital, I went straight out to the shop and I stood there looking at that car for 45 minutes without touching anything. I'm going to come back to that car. Everything in this story ends up back at that car. We had 2 kids. Vera, who's 42 and manages a hotel down in Knoxville, and has her mother's way of asking a question that sounds like a question but is actually a verdict. And my son Tanner, who is 39, lives in a subdivision outside Nashville called Kellerton Ridge, and works in real estate development. He married Melissa, who I actually like quite a lot, and I want to say that clearly because she is not the problem in this story. I want to be honest about Tanner before I say the hard things, because I don't want to set up a villain and call him my son. He was a good kid. He worked. He paid attention. When he was 16, he spent 3 Saturdays helping me pull the engine out of a 70 Chevelle, and he didn't complain once. And I remember thinking that afternoon that this kid was going to be all right. He had Ruth's patience when it came to detail work. That's rare at 16. What changed him, I think I know. His junior year of high school, a client came to the shop, a man named Carl Whitfield, who ran some kind of financial services office in Cookeville, and had a '69 Camaro SS he wanted done up for show circuit. He stood in my shop with his hands in his pockets and talked to me the way certain men talk to tradesmen, polite on the surface, but with a tone underneath that said, "I know exactly what you're worth, and it's less than what I'm about to offer you." Tanner was 17 and standing by the lift. I watched his face when I took Whitfield's number. It was a bad number and I took it because I had 3 jobs behind it, and Whitfield was paying cash, and I watched something arrive on my son's face and get quietly filed. It wasn't anger at Whitfield. It was embarrassment at me, and that's a very different thing. I didn't say a word to him about it afterward. I know exactly what I should have said, and I didn't say it, and here we are. Tanner went to Belmont in Nashville, got his license, built Crestline Partners starting with small residential deals and moving toward bigger commercial work. 8 years ago, in the fall, he drove out to the shop on a Sunday and sat on the workbench and told me he had a cash flow problem. A project in Murfreesboro had gone sideways on the permitting side. A construction loan was coming due. The bank wanted either more collateral or a cosigner with real assets. He didn't ask me. I want to be precise about that. He didn't ask. He was explaining the situation to someone he trusted, and partway through I said, "How much collateral do they need?" He told me. I thought about it for a day. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Betty Crane in Cookeville, and I set up an arrangement through which the shop property, 6 acres, the building, the equipment, everything my father left me, was used to backstop a loan guarantee, not in my name directly. Through an LLC Betty helped me form, Bledsoe Creek Holdings, named for the county road. The guarantee was secured, the loan closed, Tanner never missed a payment, and I never brought it up. That was the first one. Over 8 years there were 4 more. Different banks, different projects, same general shape. Each time Tanner explained the situation, I called Betty and we worked it through the LLC. The total exposure at its peak was $430,000. I sat with that number in Betty's office one afternoon, with a cup of coffee I'd let go cold, and I sat with it for a while. Ruth knew about the first two. She's the one who suggested the LLC structure. She said, if you put it in your name directly, he'll feel like he owes you, and he'll never be comfortable around you again. Do it quiet. Let him think he did it himself. That was Ruth. Generous in ways that were sometimes too clever by half. I think we got that wrong. I've had enough time with it now that I'm fairly certain. After Ruth died, something shifted in Tanner. It started small, the way everything that grows large starts small. 2 months after the funeral, he called and said, Dad, have you thought about the long-term plan for the property? 3 months out. Dad, I want to make sure you're okay out there by yourself. 5 months. I can't keep making the drive up to check on you, Dad. I've got 3 projects running. I had not asked him to come check on me. Not once. I called on Sundays, we talked for 10 minutes, and that was it. I came down to Nashville 3 times that whole year, and every single time it was to see Finn, his boy, 10 years old, who had become a regular in my shop on weekends, who could identify a small block Chevy by sound, who fell asleep in the back seat of the Mustang once while I was doing body work, and I didn't wake him for 2 hours. But somewhere in there, Tanner built a version of me, a widower coming apart, declining, a man who needed managing. And once someone builds a version of you, everything you do confirms it. You call, you're lonely. You don't call, you're withdrawing. You fix your own plumbing at 67, you're being unsafe. You hire it out, you're losing your grip. There is no move you can make against a version of yourself that someone else has already constructed. You just live in it and let them narrate. Then he started telling people. I found out the way you always find out, by accident from someone who assumed I already knew. My neighbor Dale Pruitt, who's farmed the field behind my shop for 20 years, ran into Tanner at a farm supply store in Cookville. Dale told me about it a week later, casually, over a fence. He said, your boy's a good man. Said he's been helping carry things since Ruth passed. I said, did he? Dale said it's a lot, but you know. Family's family. I said, that's right. 2 words and a nod, and I drove home with the whole thing sitting on the passenger seat. Here's the question I want you to sit with, because I've been sitting with it for 2 years now. If your own child was going around a county where you've lived for 40 years, telling people they were quietly carrying you, while you were the one doing the carrying, would you correct it right there in public, with Dale Pruitt standing there and a bag of fence posts between you? Or would you drive home and sit in your shop and think? I drove home and sat in my shop. I've come to believe that wasn't wisdom. I think it was pride wearing a flannel shirt. Because silence reads as agreement. Every week I didn't correct the story, Tanner got a little more settled in it. A man who's settled gets comfortable, and a man who's comfortable gets careless. Last September I drove down to Nashville to drop off a set of correct year floor mats I'd found at an estate sale. They fit a Pontiac GTO Tanner had been half-heartedly looking for since before Melissa, and I knocked, got no answer, let myself in through the garage the way I'd done 100 times. And I heard Tanner on a call in his home office with the door 3/4 shut. He said, between us, I don't think he's tracking the business side anymore since Mom died. We're probably going to need to start thinking about the property before it becomes a situation. I set the floor mats on the kitchen counter. I walked back through the garage. I drove 2.5 hours home without touching the radio. When I got there, I went into the shop and worked on the Mustang for 3 hours by flashlight. That's a bad way to do detail work, and I knew it. But when I'm angry, I need my hands doing something precise, and it's the only thing that works. Now here is the one thing I want to teach you about restoring old cars, because it's the only technical piece of this whole story and everything from here runs on it. When a car's been sitting, the rust you can see is never the rust that kills you. You grind back what's visible. You think you've got clean metal, you start welding. And 6 months later the panel falls off because the corrosion ran another 8 inches under the surface past where you stopped. The rule every good bodyman learns is this: cut back further than the damage looks, further than your instincts tell you. Cut all the way back to clean metal, or the whole thing fails eventually, and it fails at the worst possible time. I've told Tanner that since he was a teenager. I called Betty the next morning. What she told me, all 5 guarantees through Bledsoe Creek Holdings were active. 3 had renewal clauses requiring written confirmation from me by the 1st of December. If I didn't confirm, the guarantees lapsed, and the banks could call the underlying notes for immediate review. Betty put the full picture on one page. Tanner's debt load, the guaranteed portion, what would happen if I went quiet. I read that page 3 times. Betty said, Warren, if these lapse, it's going to hurt him. I said, is it going to hurt him, or is it going to make him feel it? She was quiet. She understood the difference. I said, don't confirm the renewals. Then the other thing happened. The thing that moved me from feeling hurt to making actual decisions. Vera called on a Wednesday, and Vera doesn't do small talk. She said, Dad, Tanner called me. He asked if I'd be willing to discuss a power of attorney arrangement for your finances. He said you've been making some business decisions since Mom died that worry him, and he thinks someone should have oversight. I was standing in the shop, hand on the fender of the Mustang. Vera said, Dad. I said, what did you tell him? She said, I told him I'd think about it. Then I hung up and called you. I want to tell you I went cold with rage. I didn't. What I felt was a kind of flat clarity, like the shop at 5 in the morning in January, when you can see every surface exactly as it is because there's no warmth yet to make anything soft. Up until that phone call, I'd been telling myself Tanner was scared. His mother was gone, the business had pressure on it. He'd built a story to manage his own anxiety, and scared people do ugly things, but you can reach scared. You can absolutely come back from scared. I'd have driven to Nashville 100 times to help him come back from scared. This wasn't scared. This was a man who, given the choice between having a 30-minute conversation with his father and filing legal paperwork to control his finances, had quietly started pulling the paperwork thread. You can weld over fear, you cannot weld over that. The toolbox. It was a Saturday in November. I drove to Nashville with a steel toolbox on the seat beside me. Inside it, a folder. Inside the folder, copies of every guarantee, the dates, the amounts, the LLC documents, all of it. And underneath the folder was something else. I'm not telling you what yet. You'll understand why when we get there. My plan was simple. Sit down with Tanner for 30 minutes, put the folder on the table, explain the LLC, tell him about the 8 years, and then show him what was underneath. One honest conversation before the bank started making phone calls. I wanted to give my son a real chance to understand what had been holding his business up before it got taken away. That was the plan. I parked at the curb and I could see straight through the front window into the dining room. Lights on, Melissa's car in the driveway, the shape of a dinner already in progress. I hadn't been told about any dinner. I knocked. Tanner opened the door and I watched his face do the arithmetic in less than 2 seconds. He looked at my flannel, at the truck at the curb, at the toolbox in my hand, and his expression arranged itself into something I'd seen before. Not frustration, management. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed, and he said, not loud, but in that clipped low tone that carries further than a shout, Dad, I need you to go before Melissa gets home. I can't keep being the one holding everything together. Do you understand that? I can't keep doing this. Melissa was already home. Her car was in the driveway. He knew that and I knew that, and we both knew the other one knew. And my grandson Finn, 10 years old, who has spent more Saturday mornings in my shop than probably anywhere else, who can name the difference between a 396 and a 427 by the shape of the intake, who fell asleep in the back seat of the Mustang while I was doing panel work, and I let him sleep for 2 hours because Ruth would have done the same. Finn was sitting at the dining room table, visible through the glass, looking out at us. I want to slow this part down. Finn looked at me standing on the porch, and then he looked down at the table. He was 10 years old, and in that half second he was learning something that goes in deep at that age and doesn't come out easy. He was learning that there's a category called burden, that once someone gets filed into that category, you don't look directly at them, because looking makes it worse for everyone in the room. He was learning that from his father on a Saturday night, without a word being spoken. I have forgiven most of what happened in those 2 years. I want to be honest that I have not fully forgiven that moment. The rest of it, with time, yes. That half second, not entirely. I didn't argue. I have spent 40 years around things that are either structurally sound or they aren't, and I've never once fixed something by raising my voice at it. I bent down and I set the toolbox on the porch step beside the door. Tanner said, "What is that?" I said, "It's yours. Read the folder inside before you make any calls to the banks this week." He said, "What banks?" I said, "You'll understand when you read it." I walked back to the truck. In the rear view I could see him standing on the porch in the November dark, looking at a steel toolbox. He read the folder 4 days later. Betty called to tell me Tanner had contacted her office to verify the documents were authentic. He called me that same afternoon. I was under a 72C10 when the phone buzzed on the workbench. I slid out, looked at the screen, let it ring once. Neither of us are people who lead with hello. He said, "What is Bledsoe Creek Holdings?" I said, "That's mostly your mother's idea." Long silence. He said, "Dad, how long?" I said, 8 years. First time was the Murfreesboro project. And my son, 39 years old in an office in Nashville on a Tuesday afternoon, went quiet for long enough that I checked the signal bars on my phone. Then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was maybe 20, "You let me tell people that I..." And he stopped. He heard himself say it. Not, I told people, you let me. That's the first crack right there. Not remorse yet. Just the first place where the story he'd built didn't fit the actual ground underneath it. I said, your mother wanted you to believe you did it yourself. That was her call and I agreed with it. I've had enough time to think it over and I believe we were both wrong. So that part is mine to carry too. He said, the guarantees. What happens when they lapse? I said, come out Saturday, bring Melissa. There's something else you need to see. He said, why Melissa? I said, because you've been letting her believe a version of things that isn't true, and I'm not going to be part of that for one more day. Silence. I said, and bring Finn. He came Saturday, I'll give him that. I'm not going to give you every word of what happened, because some of it belongs to Tanner and some of it belongs to Melissa and those parts are theirs to keep. But I'll give you the shape. We stood in the shop, me, Tanner, Melissa, Vera, who'd driven up from Knoxville without being asked much, and Finn, who went straight to the Mustang the way he always does. I had the overhead lights on and the lift down and the smell in there was what it always is. Oil and metal and rubber and underneath all of it something like 40 years of the same hands doing the same work. I told them everything. Standing there with my hands the way my hands always are. The LLC Betty, the 8 years, all 5 guarantees, the 430,000. I watched that number move around the shop. And then I told them about the power of attorney call to Vera. Melissa looked at Tanner. I don't know how to fully describe that look except to say it was the face of someone recalculating a long time of knowing a person, all at once, in about 4 seconds. Not rage. Something quieter and more permanent than rage. Tanner saw it. He stood there in a jacket that still had the shape of a hanger in the shoulders, and he looked at the floor. I said, 3 weeks ago I came to your house with the plan to sit down alone and tell you all of this, with no one watching. You put me off your porch in front of your son. Tanner said I was under a lot of pressure that night. I said I know, the guarantees are part of why. He looked up. I said, I'm not here to take your business. I'm here to stop carrying it without you knowing I'm under it. The difference between those two things is the difference between you having a real company and you having something I've been paying for. I have always wanted you to have a real company, Tanner. That has never changed. He didn't have anything for that right away. And then Finn, 10 years old, who had been listening to all of it from beside the Mustang, walked the full length of that shop and came and stood next to me. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on the door panel of the car and stood there. That is the moment. If I had to point to one thing across 3 years of difficulty and 1 hour of truth, that is the one I come back to. A 10-year-old boy working it out on his own, in real time, and choosing where to stand. And he chose right without anyone telling him what right looked like. Tanner saw it. He's not a stupid man. He's a man who made a wrong conclusion at 17 in a shop not too different from this one, and then spent 20 years building a life around it. And that morning in November, he could see, finally, exactly what he'd constructed and what it was resting on. He said quietly, the rust thing, what you always said. I said, cut back to clean metal. He said, yeah. We're not a family that goes in for long speeches. What happened after? I'll be straight with you because I think these stories owe you that. Crestline Partners had a hard 6 months. 2 of the banks did require additional collateral when the guarantees lapsed. Tanner sold the second vehicle and renegotiated terms on one of the smaller notes. He brought in a business partner, a woman he'd known for years who understood the financing side in ways he never had. And that partnership has been good for him. The company is smaller. It is also genuinely his for the first time. Melissa stayed. I expected that, actually. She's a practical woman and she held him to a clear accounting of things, and he agreed to it, and she watched whether he meant it. That's a real marriage. I have no complaints. Vera drives up once a month now. She does not ask about my jacket. Tanner came out in April, by himself on a Saturday, in an old shirt, in a 9-year-old Subaru he'd had since before the good years. He stood at the end of the driveway and said, can I help with the Mustang? Not can I come in, not can we talk, can I help with the car? I said, you know where the gloves are. We worked on it for about 4 hours. He did what I told him, asked good questions, got it wrong twice and corrected it both times without being asked. At one point we were both lying under the car and he said, I've been thinking about what I said on the call to Vera. About oversight. He said, I was doing to you exactly what Whitfield did in this shop when I was 17, and I remember watching you take it and I thought less of you for it. I never told you that. I should have told you that a long time ago. I finished the beat I was running. I said, I should have said something to you in that shop in 1999. I kept my mouth shut because I told myself silence was dignity. It wasn't. It was just quiet. He said, yeah. I said, we're square. We were both holding tools. We didn't shake hands. Now, what was under the folder? Tanner asked me that Saturday in April before he got in the car. He said, Dad, the toolbox, you said read the folder. I read it. I never went any further. I went inside and got it from the kitchen drawer where I'd put it, after he hadn't opened it in November. It was the title to the Mustang, signed over to his name. Ruth and I had started that car 11 years ago. She'd chosen it. She drove past one in a dealership lot in 1987 and never fully got over it. And when we found the Cookville barn car, she said, this is the one. This is ours. She had opinions about the color, a very specific dark green that Ford called Ivy that she'd spotted once in a parking lot and spent 6 months tracking down the paint code for. By the time she died, we were about a year from done. I finished it without her. The title was in Tanner's name because that was always what Ruth wanted. She told me once while she was sorting through a box of old interior trim she'd sourced from a dealer in Georgia. This is the kind of thing you can't buy your way into. Either someone spent 11 years building you something with their own hands, or they didn't. Let's make sure he has one. I came to his doorstep that night in November to give my son an apple his mother had grown for 30 years, and he had decided before I'd said a word that he already knew what I'd come for. He read the folder. He never lifted it. Tanner stood in my driveway in April holding that title for a long time, not saying anything. I didn't push. Finally he said, the green. I said, Ivy, your mother spent 6 months on the code. He nodded. He folded the title and put it in his shirt pocket, carefully, the way you handle something you know matters. He hasn't driven the car yet. He's been coming out most weekends since April, 5 times now, and each time he does a little more of the finish work himself. The leather on the passenger door panel is his. The headliner is going to be his. He asked if he could do the final paint prep on the driver's door, and I said yes, and I checked it, and it was clean. Not perfect, but clean, which is what matters. Finn came out with him last month. He asked if he could help with the door sill. I gave him 220 grit and showed him which direction to follow the grain, and he worked at it for nearly an hour without stopping or complaining once. He's 10 years old. His patience is better than his father's, was at twice the age, which is either Ruth coming through or something he picked up on his own. And either way, I'll take it. Before they left, Finn stood beside the Mustang and looked at it the way I'd seen Ruth look at it. That look you give something when you can already see what it's going to become, not just what it is right now. He said, Grandpa, when it's done, can I ride in it? I said, you're going to do better than ride in it. He looked at me. I said, you're going to help finish it. He thought that over for a moment, the way he thinks things over, seriously, without hurry, and then he said, okay, like it was simply the next right thing, and he went back to work. Here is what I know now that I wish someone had handed me 40 years ago, because I have earned the right to say it plainly. Silence is not dignity. I told myself for 30 years that staying quiet was strength, that correcting small things was beneath me, that responding to slights only made them larger. What I was actually doing was letting a story about me get built, one unchallenged sentence at a time, until it was load-bearing and I couldn't touch it without bringing down something Tanner had built his whole sense of himself around. Correct the small things. Say the sentence, just one, without heat, without trying to win. That's not quite right. Here's what's actually true. It costs 30 seconds of discomfort. What it buys you is the right to remain a whole person in the minds of the people who matter most to you. I didn't. And by the end, my own son was on the phone to my daughter using a word like oversight, and I was standing in a shop with a car I'd spent 11 years building for him, wondering whether the man I'd built it for still existed underneath everything he'd become. He does. I know that now. He's underneath it, and he's working his way back out, 30 minutes at a time, with a piece of sandpaper in a car that his mother picked out of a barn because she believed, the way she believed most things, quietly and without needing anyone to agree with her, that it was worth saving. I think she was right. She usually was.